From courtside of the virtual hardwood, it's the NLSC Podcast, a weekly show for basketball gamers and hardcore hoopheads. Andrew with you once again, joined as always by my co-host Derek, aka Deeper3. Derek, we've been having a blast with basketball video games as of late, connected over the weekend to play as we so often do, and you can't put a price on fun like that. Or can you? We'll see, so over to you to tip us off.
Yeah, and some of these classics, like NBA 2K9, like NBA 2K14 for Xbox One, those games are timeless. They play incredibly well. And Andrew, as you know, you can get those for super cheap.
Yep.
At certain local stores or even online. Like I stated, I picked up the Xbox One version of NBA 2K14 at one point from GameStop for under $2. And that game definitely is worth more than that. You can sink a lot of time into it. And how many hours have you sunk into the PS4 gen version of NBA 2K14? Thousands.
Yeah, about 5,000 now, I think it's up to.
That is one hell of a return on investment.
Yes.
For this episode, we will be discussing what we believe to be a fair price for video games today. We have been gaming for decades, Andrew, but the most serious shifts in gaming history as it relates to cost has taken place over the last 10 years. Are games and consoles priced fairly? Should they be even more expensive? We will weigh in, but we also want you to weigh in. Let us know what you think in the YouTube comments section. So what we'll be discussing, and this was also part of a community question, is what we believe the cost should be for fully featured games made by big studios, fully featured games made by small studios, indie, online-only games, and mobile games. But before we get into that, I wanted to share an article, and I thought this was really well written, and there's no shilling going on in this article, and I love that. I was trying to find articles that really covered the whole cost of video games issue, cost of video games, cost of consoles. And it was really hard to find one that really touched on a lot of the pain points that consumers are feeling, because what you'll find normally is a whole lot of shilling, right, for the industry, talking about, rationalizing the cost in an unfair way, not using all talking points, not using appropriate context. So I really like this article from 2023.
Yeah, there is a disturbing amount of shilling when it comes to this topic, and it trickles down to the gamers. How many times have we talked about those issues only to receive pushback? Oh, it's business, inflation, bro, things like that. I got that comment a lot when I posted my article about the rising cost of my career, how it costs more both in-game to upgrade your player, and of course the external cost as well if you need to buy that VC. And there were people pushing back on that saying, oh, inflation, bro, it's business. And yes, of course, gaming is a business, video games are a product, so they need to be profitable. But of course, there's a lot of greed involved there. And why are we standing with big corporations over our fellow gamer? Why are we accepting the recurrent revenue mechanics? It just boggles the mind.
Yeah, and I think there's a loud minority that are doing that. I think that a lot of people are frustrated overall with the prices of these games. The fact that there's so much DLC out there that you have to pay for after, microtransactions, the price of consoles. Look at the price of consoles today, right? And I think that the loud minority creeps in every now and then in the comment sections, and unfortunately, those comments do get a lot of attention. But as it relates to these articles, I think that a lot of those quote unquote opinion articles or whatnot are bought and paid for by influence.
Oh, great.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate. And that's why I actually chose this article from The Gamer, is because it seems like a very honest article. It doesn't seem like someone shilling. The writer is Stacey Henley. Stacey Henley is the Newcastle-born and based editor-in-chief at The Gamer, and an award-winning features writer with experience across written and video content. And the article that she wrote on May 1st, 2023 is called "Games Are Too Expensive These Days for Everyone." So let's break this down. I'm going to read the article and we'll give our opinions on it. It starts, "Everyone would agree that games are too expensive now. And when I say everyone, I mean everyone. Whether it's indie developers trying to scrape together the cash to stay afloat, major studios attempting to push the envelope, publishers trying to make a profit, or regular gamers staring at their wallets. Games cost too much money. This is an issue I think about a lot. So there were two news stories over the past weekend which caught my eye. Now remember, this is again back in May of 2023. She states the first was that the CMA Activision Microsoft merger report claimed AAA projects can have budgets that go into the billions. The second was that the $70 price point is putting a lot of players off buying new games. Together, these two stories paint a picture of an unsustainable future. Like she's stating, the cost of making the game and then players not wanting to spend $70 or more on said games. The CMA report is basing this off publisher claims rather than listed budgets, but it's easy to believe this will be the case in the future, if it's not already. CD Projekt Red spent $316 million on making Cyberpunk 2077, and that's before you account for its astronomical marketing. Modern Call of Duty games cost around the same. The Callisto Protocol, considered to be a mid-tier AAA game, had development costs of $162 million. Genshin's Impact, so I didn't butcher that, ongoing development and support totals around $500 million. One unnamed studio in the CMA report had a development budget of $660 million with a marketing cost of almost $550 million. For those making them, games are just too expensive. She continues, as for players, it's unsurprising that the increased price point is putting them off. It's near impossible to factor in what a game is worth compared to what they were sold 20 years ago, because you don't just look at inflation, but also wage stagnation, the changing demographic of gamers, the increase in technology, the difference in narrative and graphical quality, the longer playtimes, but also, Andrew, the rise in patches, broken launches, microtransactions, and online subscriptions. And those pieces, Andrew, are the pieces that most of those other articles that I was mentioning leave out.
Gloss
like
over.
They barely touch on them, or they don't touch on them at all. She continues, the whole media landscape has changed. It's impossible to compare a video game released today to a video game released in the 1990s. They are a different species. In the 1980s, you'd go to the cinema and see Star Wars. In the 2020s, it's the MCU. That's a fairly consistent media market. Gaming has changed far more drastically. So I want to point something out. She is correct. In a lot of the games today, and I know this because my brother and I play a lot of non-sports games as well, there are definitely longer play times, right? We can sink oftentimes hundreds of hours into the games that we're playing. Games like Elden Ring or Code Vein, or a game like Monster Hunter World, which just has a ton of content. I could go on and on. But while there are longer playtimes, while graphics have gotten better, with the PS4, PS5 gen games and whatnot, there's just a lot of issues with a lot of these games at launch. A lot of times, like NBA 2K, for example, a lot of times these developers release games incomplete and then bank on patches in order to fix issues later on. So a lot of times people are not getting a complete product, a complete working product when they buy it. Microtransactions. So people will get in the door sometimes at a AAA price, something they would have paid for a full game back in the day. So, $60, $70 and whatnot. And then, if you want to play certain content in the game, boom, $10 more, $20 more, $30 more. And that adds up over time. A lot of the games that are not sports games, if you want certain armor, if you want certain weapons, if you want to get into a certain area, if you want to fight new bosses, all of that stuff, that's more money
a pay game,
out of your pocket and whatnot. Online subscriptions, there's games still like Final Fantasy 14 and other games that have like a monthly subscription model that you pay for. I don't know if Final Fantasy 14 still does that, but they were doing that for a while. And then subscriptions to things like Game Pass and whatnot. You and I grew up, Andrew, with video games, right? But what happened when we bought a video game back then? What you would get is you would get a game that was complete, and you knew that you weren't going to have to sink any more money into that game, whether it was sports, whether it was an RPG, whether it was action, whether it was adventure. You got your game, and that was it. However, now there are all these different variables. when it comes to purchasing these games. And the thing is it's not just AAA games. And I think you would agree. You see this with a lot of indie games. You see it with a lot of strategy games. You see it with a lot of free-to-play, quote-unquote, games, right? Like, oh, this is a free-to-play game, and you download the game, and it's like, I can't really do much in this game. I can't progress in this game until I put a bunch of money into it. So it's not just the AAA games that are more expensive and AAA companies that are, kind of taking advantage of consumers. It's also sometimes the smaller studios and the smaller projects that are doing the same thing.
Oh, absolutely. And another difference back in the day that people like to point out is that we rented a lot of games, which was fantastic. Obviously, we didn't always buy games. We didn't always have a huge collection. A lot of the games that we played, we probably rented or borrowed from friends. But to that point, with digital distribution, we can't always do that now. We can't always share games and swap and borrow games as we used to. And people also like to point out that there were bad games back in the day, broken games, games that launched with very little content, nowhere near good enough for the price tag, nowhere near good enough as far as the quality of the experience, terrible gameplay, etc. But when you look at the best games from back in the day, there is that difference in completeness at launch as far as quality and not needing to be patched, and also content. That is the difference, is that back in the day, the best games were complete. They were fantastic. So many of them hold up, compared to today, where many of the best games will still have those recurrent revenue mechanics or DLC, things that used to be in the game back in the day. They used to be unlockable. There were expansion packs, of course, but you felt that was even more content for an already huge game, often a way to tide you over in between sequels, full sequels to games. So people like to make that argument that there were broken games back in the day, which there absolutely were. It's not like they were putting out flawless masterpieces that couldn't have used a patch, or couldn't have used more time, or weren't quality products, but we're talking about the best games, and the best games back then didn't need that stuff. They were complete. We could sink hours into them. The best games these days do have those issues with both greed and technical problems.
Right. And also back then, when you bought a game, you knew there was going to be a beginning and an end, and that any content in the game, you already had it. Yeah. Right? You already owned it. You didn't need to put more money in to get the ending, to get into an additional area, or to fight a certain boss, or to get some certain armor or anything like that. And on the basketball games, it's like, you had your season mode, you're able to play playoffs. If the game had All-Star Weekend like NBA Live 2005, you knew that it was in the game, right? Yeah. And that you weren't going to have to, put extra money into it to unlock that content.
And of course, you didn't lose it when online support ended. So many modes these days are dependent on online content, online connections. Look at the impending server shutdown for NBA Live 19 next year. I'm not going to be able to play Ultimate Team, which I've been having a blast with. The Legends are going to be unavailable to me as of January next year. Will I still revisit Live 19? Probably. I do like it, but it speaks volumes that since the servers for NBA Live 18 shut down last year, as much as I love that game, I haven't really touched it because I was really enjoying playing with the Legends. That is content that is gone because they're not available offline, which, as I pointed out in an article, is a huge misstep because they could have made pretty good all-decade teams for offline content in NBA Live 18 and 19, but the point is that content is gone now. So these days, even if we have access to that content at the beginning, which we don't when it comes to the card collecting modes, they are tied to microtransactions, grinding, loot box mechanics, etc. But even if we do, like My Career, for example, there's no offline My Career anymore. We lose access to an entire mode once the servers shut down. So we're losing parts of games, big chunks of games, in fact, whereas back in the day, the games, they remained intact forever.
If there was ever an age of disposable games, we are in it.
Yeah.
Right now. She also mentioned something that I think speaks to a lot of people's thoughts on this. She mentions inflation, but also wage stagnation, right? And, prices have gone up across the board on most everything, and wages haven't caught up to that, right? So at times it almost feels like apples and oranges comparing it to the way it used to be when wages were more in line with the cost of everything.
Disproportionate.
It was more balanced and whatnot. But look at the housing costs today. Look at food costs. And then, look at what people are making. That factors in here in a major way. And if you hike up the prices of video games because they're more expensive to make, and you're not getting the return you want, well, that's more than likely because people don't want to spend above and beyond their means when, things in life are tough, right? Wages haven't caught up to inflation. So I really like the fact that she brought that up in this article.
It's a really important point that people like to dismiss or gloss over. And once again, we don't have that facility to rent games like we used to borrow games back in the day from a video store, obviously, but also friends. Yes, there's Steam sharing. We can connect via Parsec, obviously, and remote desktop into other people's PCs and play and things like that. But there's no rental system like the old days. It was much easier when we could hand our friends a cartridge or a disc and swap games, borrow them temporarily. These days, you have to jump through some hoops. You are restricted as far as what you're allowed to share, so you don't have that ability to share that experience. And one friend buys one game, another friend buys another game. You both play them individually, play them together, swap them for a while. And of course, I'm sure a lot of people have horror stories of the game they never got back, but that's another thing, and there's kind of a twist and nostalgia to that. But we don't have the same flexibility as far as alleviating that cost these days.
Steam's version of renting games, Andrew, is the 2-hour return window. Basically,
pretty much, yeah.
You can buy a game, try it out for under 2 hours, and then if you decide you want to return it, you can just return it. I believe that there's also a reason that they provide when you return a game on Steam that says this is not fun. So you can literally just be like, this is not fun. And return the game. I also want to point out something that's important to know. They're talking about targeted demographics. Look at the price of college today. And look at the price of living in dorms, and look at the prices of housing outside of dorms and whatnot. The prices are astronomical. They are crazy. And a lot of these college students in a major way are penny pinching. A lot of these kids that are in school, they got to really watch what they buy. And I can guarantee you that factors into sales in video games. Same thing with people that aren't in college and whatnot. Maybe they enter the workforce right out of high school and whatnot. And, they're not making as much as they're probably worth, or it's probably as much as they should earn. And that's going to factor in, what they're willing to spend on video games and consoles and accessories, etc. So those things are very important to know. She continues, this is not to argue that the $70 price point is fair. If it doesn't make sense for your audience, then it's not fair. That's the bottom line here. I only mean you can crunch the numbers however you like and determine that $70 is too low, too high, or just right. Usually it's whichever answer you already thought. What are the chances? Studios and publishers can point to these increased budgets and offer a defense of the $70 price, along with often stuffing their games with pointless filler that adds hours onto the playtime but ultimately makes the game worse. And I've actually seen that in many different games. It's, the playthrough time is 70 hours, but really it's like 50 hours of garbage.
How much is fun?
Filler, like she calls it, right? And then really the only fun that there is with the game is the end game stuff, or after you've already put in 20, 30, 40 hours into a game, and then also some paid for some DLC or some microtransactions. She continues, there are times when these high development prices seem worth it, and everyone just goes about their lives. It has already been a decade since the last GTA game, and the next one is still years away, with just Red Dead Redemption 2 in the middle. Naughty Dog released The Last of Us a decade ago, and in the time since has only brought out Uncharted 4 and The Last of Us Part 2 as fully fledged releases, as well as some remasters, expansions or spin-offs, and collections. Of course, to say only feels insulting. GTA 5, Red Dead Redemption 2, The Last of Us, Uncharted 4, and The Last of Us Part 2 would all be contenders for the top 10 games released since 2013. Studios are taking their time and spending a lot of cash, but they're making masterpieces. Except most of them aren't. And this is a very good point, right? She continues, we are seeing games be delayed for months and even years, have huge budgets, be sold at full price, and still end up pretty average at best. The Callisto Protocol, with 162 million thrown at it, scoring a disappointing 70 on Metacritic, and did not meet sales expectations. Gotham Knights arriving 9 years after developer WB Games Montreal's last game, and with heavy marketing, not to mention the obvious costs for its franchise, scored a near unheard of score for AAA games at 64 and flopped commercially. The stars do not seem aligned for Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League either. And that's a very important point. We see a lot of games today, Andrew. And like she states, most of them are average or below. Most of them are flops. There's a select few that are pretty damn awesome. But how many of these games actually deserve that AAA price? How many of them actually deserve to be $60 or $70? How many of them even deserve to be $30 or $40 based on the experience that gamers are getting out of them, or the incomplete experience as it relates to over and above costs over the base price of the game?
Yeah, with sports games, basketball games, as we play, you have that different model where you have an annual release. You have a game coming out every year, full price, that is going to be no longer supported within a couple of years. NBA Live has been supported for 5 to 7 years. The 8th generation releases, that's very uncommon for them to do that. And that's basically more of a courtesy to people who were giving those games a chance and still playing them years later, like the dedicated NBA Live 19 community. With 2K, they originally offered 18 months of support when there was that big fuss with the 2K14 servers being shut down. One of the first big PR blunders for NBA 2K, talking about retired saves and it's time to move on and all good things come to an end. That was a big deal back in the day, and it led to them reactivating the servers and extending online support to 27 months, which is nice. It does give us that little bit of extra time. A lot of people do move on, but to that point, there are people moving on each and every year, spending full price or even more with the special editions, even more on VC on top of that, to upgrade every year, to get the new rosters, to get the new features, to get fixes. So a lot of people are spending money year after year on these games that do have these problems. And of course, yes, we can choose not to buy these games. That is always an option. But the point is, we're not always getting value for money, a quality product for the price we pay. And that's what people are pushing back on, because it's easy enough to say, oh, don't buy the games. Good advice, absolutely. But these games are coming out every year with these flaws, with this lack of improvement at the full price, pushing people to spend even more money. You know, we're allowed to criticize that, Derek.
Yeah, I also want to point out something else related to the target demographic. Okay, and most of the time, the target demographic are kids. They're teenagers or even younger at times. And where are these kids getting their money, Andrew? They're stressed out parents, right?
Absolutely,
the parents who are working 2 jobs, the parents who are struggling with money, oftentimes both parents working, or a single parent home. And they are trying to, accommodate their kids, and they're trying to do it the best they possibly can, but they don't have those extra funds. And I think that's going to hurt game sales as well. And when their kid says, well, I want a season pass on NBA 2K, their parent might not have the money for that. Right. The kid says that they need VC, and they don't have their own money. They're going to go to their parents, and their parents might not have those funds. I think there's just a lot of different variables, right? Like I said, whether it's kids in college, whether it's kids younger than college age trying to get money from their parents, or maybe working a part-time job while they're in school and not making enough to make ends meet, et cetera. So, there's a lot of different variables there.
Yeah, once again, that pressure is there to spend, and people can say, oh, it's optional, but it's never been less optional if you want the optimal experience. And if you compare that to older games that had expansion packs, you still had that full experience of the original game. The expansion packs were a way to expand them, basically, to add something extra well above and beyond the original game, kind of to tide you over in between sequels, or if there was never a sequel coming, it's kind of the pseudo-sequel, but you've still got that full experience. I'd refer to Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas here. I love both games vanilla. There is so much content there that even if I didn't have the DLCs back in the day, or the Ultimate Editions that have all of the DLC included, those games are still a blast. The questionable ending for Fallout 3 aside, that the Broken Steel DLC fixed, but that's a long story. The point is that I felt like I got value for money for those DLCs. They expanded those games to the point where it felt like I kind of had 2 games in one for both of them. It felt worth the money, that DLC. That's how expansion packs used to work. It wasn't stripping out content to sell the special edition or DLC later to the point where the vanilla version of the game feels like it has less content than it should. And it's funny, 12 years ago, there was that big controversy during the lead-up to the launch of the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4, where Microsoft wanted the Xbox One to be always online. And they were kind of making fun of people who didn't like that. And there was a big backlash. And Sony came out and said, oh, if you want to swap games, here's how you do it. And they did a little skit where one person hands another person a disc. This is how easy it is to lend games on PlayStation 4, because originally Xbox One wasn't going to allow you to do that. There was going to be those digital rights that you owned a game, you couldn't buy it secondhand, you couldn't swap it with a friend, lend it to a friend. So that really hurt Microsoft back then. And it's funny that these days, I think people would actually defend Microsoft in that situation. So yeah, attitudes have really shifted in the past decade or so.
I would hope with something like that common sense would prevail.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I think that's pretty black and white. I also want to point out, too, now that you bring up consoles, we're talking about games, but look at the price of consoles, Andrew. Right? Look at the price of the PS5 through its cycle. Look at the price of Xbox Series consoles. The S was favorably priced, early on. I want to say at times it was around $200. Pretty good deal, actually, on a new console. But, you want the latest up-to-date consoles, $500, $600. At one point, I think PS5 was at $700, and I think they're still around those prices. Where are these kids getting the money for that, Andrew? You know what I'm talking about? I'm talking about the kids that, either don't make their own money or they're working only part-time jobs trying to make ends meet and everything. And what about these college kids and everything? Where is the money coming from? I know that some people can afford it, but in these times of inflation and rising costs and, oftentimes of parents working two jobs or both parents working to try to make ends meet and everything, it's tough. And now let's talk about the prices of accessories. You're still looking at, controllers for $50, $60, $70, any other accessories, et cetera. It's a lot. So, you brought up consoles. That's the first thing I thought of, how do they even get their foot in the door? And I think we talked about this before. There's a reason why so many people stayed on PS4, right? Not only was PS5 and Xbox Series consoles not a big jump from the last gen of consoles, it's questionable if it was a jump at all. And the game library for PS4 and Xbox One, they're massive, and there's so many great games that were made for those consoles. A lot of people just stayed on those consoles, because of the rising costs, because they didn't think it was worth the upgrade.
Yeah, and you mentioned price, and that's in US dollars, obviously. And I was just looking up the current prices for PlayStation 5 here in Australia. The PS5 Slim Digital Console, 825GB hard drive, $749. The PS5 Pro console, $1,200. We're getting into
crazy
kind of PC, mid-range gaming PC prices here in Australia at $1,200 or so. So yeah, they're definitely going up in price. Before we go on, a reminder that the NLSC podcast comes out every week on the NLSC, nba-live.com, as well as our YouTube channel. We're also on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast apps. If you're listening on any of those apps, we'd greatly appreciate a review. To keep up with the show and everything we're doing with basketball gaming in general, connect with us on social media. On Twitter and Facebook, we are the NLSC. We also have an Instagram, NLSC Basketball, and on YouTube, we're youtube.com/NBA Live Series Center. Once again, visit us at nba-live.com, where in addition to the podcast, you'll also find all of our original content, as well as our forum and modding community.
So she continues, it doesn't matter that these games aren't as good as Red Dead Redemption 2, or at least it shouldn't. But when their costs run to 9 figures and they have development cycles that mean they take longer than medical school, they kind of need to be. Modern game development means every studio is always seeking to make a masterpiece. It's always paying for it, and it's always charging for it. Even in a medium where the critics are generous with perfect scores, they often fall short. But they've already paid for it, so they're still going to charge you for it. And that's also the other piece of this, is a lot of the microtransactions in these games, a lot of the DLC and everything are companies trying to catch up, right? They're trying to get a return on their investment with making that game. And it's gamers that lose out, Andrew. And it's unfortunate because I think that there's been games that don't have microtransactions, that don't have paid for DLC. I think one of them was Baldur's Gate, which was used as an example, where the game just hit. It was complete. It was full. It was fun. Gamers absolutely loved it, and they made more than a return on their investment with no microtransactions. And that's because they made a quality product and priced it fairly. So I think that's a good example. But yeah, like she states, a lot of these companies, they're spending so much to make these games. They're like, how are we going to make that money back?
Yeah, absolutely. And you do wonder sometimes if it is necessary. You look at some of the things they've added to NBA 2K over the years, some of the actors they've brought in for My Career Stories. And I do have a love-hate relationship with My Career Stories. Some of the best ones have been pretty well produced, but that's all part of the budget, and you don't necessarily need to have that to have a great My Career experience. And again, padding the budget, so there's no savings being passed on to the gamer.
She continues, here's the crux of the issue. When I was a kid, my favorite games were Crash Bandicoot, Spyro, and Tomb Raider. I got a new game from all of them every year. From 1996 to 2003, Tomb Raider had one game every year, 2 in the year 2000. It then took a 3-year break and came back with my favorite game in the series and went on another run of 3 games in 3 years. Crash went back to back from 96 to 98. Spyro had a decade-long unbroken streak from 1998 to 2008, although, admittedly, they weren't all winners. I know some of these games, even the great ones, don't hold up today. When they brought back Crash and Spyro for remasters, they had to pack the trilogy together so they added up to a reasonable playtime for modern audiences. And as I mentioned above, the audience is very different. Length used to come from challenging difficulty. Now it comes from easy filler. And I love that point as well. Some of the best games that I played growing up, they weren't super long, but man, were they challenging. Games that you would play and you would die 2,000 times before you won, right? Before you reached endgame, before you conquered that video game. But yeah, there's the games now, it feels like you can play a game for 50 hours, sometimes more, and not even get a challenge overall. You might not even die once, depending, if it's an RPG, an action game, adventure game, and whatnot. And, it's just a bunch of cinematics, a bunch of cutscenes, and they're still pushing you through that time to upgrade your armor, upgrade your weapons. They're showing you the in-game store because they're trying to get you to spend more money, all of that. You have a game like Elder Scrolls Online that has a whole bunch of areas that are locked behind paywalls, and you have to pay extra money in order to unlock those areas and fight those bosses and everything. And then there's just a lot of filler and a lot of easy stuff in that game. So I see exactly where she's coming from. It felt like if you got a video game back then, it may be shorter, but it was complete and it was challenging and it was more fulfilling than a lot of these games that are made today that are a lot longer with playtime, because it feels like there's just a lot of fluff in there.
Totally agreed. To play devil's advocate, I will say that there is good ways and bad ways of doing both. I'm going to pull out my classic example here, Derek. Bart vs. the Space Mutants. Yes, it's been maybe 10 shows since I mentioned it, but that is a game with artificial difficulty, mostly from poor mechanics. The difficulty of using those mechanics extends that game. The only reason that game has any kind of longevity or replayability, such as it is, much as I love it, it is a broken game, is because it has artificial difficulty. On the other hand, you've got games like Fallout 3, Fallout New Vegas, Fallout 4, that aren't necessarily difficult. Well, they are at the start, they certainly can be, and you can also ramp up the difficulty, but they're not Souls-like as far as their difficulty, for example. But there's such a huge, interesting world to explore, so many quests, so many characters to meet, a lot of fun battles that you can have, a lot of fun things to find, interesting things, world-building elements. So there is something there that's not just filler. But to your point, so many games do pad out their experience, pump up the hours with filler content. NBA 2K does it, running around the neighborhood or the city. The grind, the grind that isn't fun, which of course you can pay to skip, but then why are you paying to not play the game? And that is the other issue with games these days. There is a good way and bad way of doing both, obviously, but generally speaking, yeah, there is a lot of padding in games these days that shouldn't have it.
And I found some gems, right? This isn't speaking to all games. There's
Sure.
games that I bought at the base price that gave me just an unbelievable experience without having to put any extra money into it. You know,
Definitely.
games like Remnant from the Ashes, Remnant 2, games like Code Vein, games like Outward. I could, Monster Hunter World overall, just an amazing game. And all the games that I'm mentioning are also incredibly challenging, right? Strangers of Paradise, Neo. There's still a lot of games out there that you get in the front door at the base price, either $60 or $70, and a lot of times with these games, Andrew, they go on sale, right? You get them for $40 or you'll get them for $30, and I can sink hundreds of hours into these games, oftentimes co-op, like the ones that I just mentioned, and they are super challenging, engaging, and fun, and they're not loaded with filler. However, it feels like a lot of the games that I did not name, and I've seen them and I've experienced them by buying them on Steam or downloading them on console and whatnot, are super uninspiring. They don't feel complete. They feel like a slog, and it feels oftentimes like an attempt at a money grab and whatnot. So she finishes the article with, but the fact remains that gaming used to be able to produce major hits and rewarding experiences for much cheaper and still leave its audience satisfied. Now we're made to wait 5 years or more between series and then drop $70 for them. Studios have to charge us that much because it costs them $700 million to make and market. Things can't keep going this way. It's just too expensive. And, I like that she's also speaking to the cost of game development, right? I mean, everybody's hurting here overall. The companies that are dealing with elevated costs of making the game, and then the consumers who are on a tight budget, oftentimes the majority of the time, because wages haven't caught up with inflation. So there's two different battles going on.
And it seems only appropriate that she mentions GTA 5. As you said, the article is from 2023. It was 10 years at that point since the last GTA game. Now being 12, it's going to be 13. They've just announced that GTA 6 has been pushed back again. So it's still very relevant 2 years later. And to that point, back in the day with the GTA series, I know that's not really your thing. I have played the GTA series, was a big fan of it in the early 2000s. Didn't really like 4 and 5 as much. I do want to revisit them. But yeah, I am actually partial to the older games, the PS2 era games, and have been enjoying the trilogy as much as people say that it hasn't aged well. I see the point, but I do actually still enjoy those games as they were, even play them with the classic controls to that point. But we were getting games very close together. GTA 3 in 2001, Vice City, the spin-off in 2002, 2004, San Andreas, Liberty City Stories in 2005, Vice City Stories in 2006. Yes, they were reusing the same engine, obviously, but we were getting all these games in this series over the span of less than 10 years, and now there's more than a decade between games. Same with Fallout. Fallout 4 coming out in 2015. They're coming out with the 10th anniversary edition of that. Fallout 76, the online game, came out in 2018, of course, but again, it's been 10 years since the last single-player mainline release, so we are waiting longer in between games. And yes, they are a bigger undertaking, bigger budgets these days, but it doesn't necessarily deliver the experience.
Yeah, I mean, look how amazing the game libraries were overall for early PS4 gen, PS3 gen, the PS2, PS1, and then going back to even, just Super NES, Sega Genesis, NES. Look how big the game libraries were, and look how consistent the releases were. And now look what we have with PS5 and Xbox Series Gen, which started in 2021, by the way. So we've been in this now for, coming up on 5 years, and there's been very few releases for these new consoles, and a lot of that could come from the cost, of making these games, and companies not wanting to take risks in this climate. But I want to bring up one more article and just a couple points from it from 2015, and this was written by Forbes, and it states video games should be more expensive, and it states in the article But a lot of the practices that bother consumers the most, from DLC to pre-order bonuses to microtransactions and full-price games, are a result of one unpleasant truth. Video games really ought to cost more, thanks to inflation, than they do today. And then it brings up the cost of certain games back in the day. NES cartridges for around $50 in 1990, and 64 games costing around $70 in 1998. And then, if you factored in inflation, those games, would be around $100 today. But again, he's not mentioning wages, right? They're just saying inflation, but wages haven't caught up to the inflation of everything. We're talking about everything. He talks about the price of Oreos back in 94 compared to 2014, the $2 increase, etc. But it's this piece that I wanted to touch on most. He says video games, on the other hand, have seen skyrocketing development costs, with much larger teams required to create a AAA product than in the past. Besides the larger teams, voice acting and scoring and various other additional costs have been added. It continues, competition has also become far more fierce in the video game industry, and marketing budgets have exploded, especially for high-profile games like Destiny. The fact is, games are actually cheaper than they were before, and yet they cost quite a lot more to make. That's why we have DLC and microtransactions, to balloon the cost of an underpriced $60 game closer to the inflation-adjusted cost of $100, which is what it should be at. The alternative is cheaper games and smaller budgets, something that seems plenty unlikely these days. So I just want to point out that it's missing the entire context. And by the way, this was back in 2015. Things are a lot worse with wages and inflation now. It's leaving out the entire context that inflation is in everything, right? And that wages haven't caught up. It's making comparisons of, this is what the price of video games were back then, and they're roughly the same now, and they should be more expensive now. But it's not talking to the real issue at hand, and is, number one, are these video games really worth as much as they're charging for them? And two, the cost of everything, for the most part, is higher, and wages haven't caught up. So in my opinion, that's sort of an apples and oranges comparison.
Missing the forest for the trees. And to that point, look at all the great indie games that have come along since with smaller budgets. I think that article was wide of the mark there, that you can't make a great game or deliver that great experience without a big budget. Can you do all of the things the AAA studio does, bringing in high-profile actors and things like that to voice characters? No, obviously not. But you have seen indie games have fine graphics and certainly a fantastic gameplay experience. So the idea that anything has to be big budget to be good. I mean, there have been a lot of big budget movies that have absolutely flopped. They've had terrible scripts, terrible acting, terrible stories. Big budgets do not necessarily make a great product. And as far as the cost of producing games, developing games, there's an article from PC Gamer recapping some things that Fallout co-creator Tim Kaine talked about on his YouTube channel. And I'll just read some of that very quickly. Kaine strikes a pretty pro-digital distribution tone at the video start. Being able to stick a game on Steam rather than order print runs of discs means devs have more time to work on games, because there's less lead time between finishing development and shipping. It means games are easier to patch, and it means old games, like many classics Kaine worked on, can remain easily accessible in hopefully perpetuity. But where things really heat up is with Kaine's thoughts on how digital distribution has impacted game pricing. Digital is cheaper, says Kaine. It's cheaper for everybody. It's less cost all around. In theory, he continues, prices should have dropped, but they didn't. In Kaine's telling of events, rather than spread the wealth out of sheer generosity of spirit, the capitalists just kind of, kept it. These cost savings for being digital, those should have been passed on to consumers. They didn't. The argument I hear is, costs were rising in development, so they were balanced. I don't think they were balanced. In other words, the money saved on not having to do physical media anymore got pocketed by the corporations. And there's more you can read on that PC Gamer article, but basically he's kind of pushing back on the idea that, games should be more expensive, especially when so many of them are digital exclusives and sold digitally and still having to pay the same price as a physical release. And of course, being in Australia as I am, games have to be imported, so there was obviously that markup there, but that's not the case with digital distribution. So I think it's telling that somebody who has worked in the industry has that perspective.
I love it. That's more context, right? Something that absolutely impacts the bottom line in favor of the publishers of these games, the developers, etc. So, Andrew, before I get to the community's responses on this topic, I wanted us to share our thoughts. So I'm going to throw it over to you first. What do you believe is a fair price for a fully featured video game made by a big studio?
So I've got a couple of ranges here, and I've also got both Australian and US dollars. I've said for a big studio, 75 to 90 Australian dollars, which is 50 to 60 US dollars, which has been the standard price for a long time. I think that's fairly reasonable. That is certainly what I'm willing to pay for a couple of games every year, especially if they're not stripping out content to sell as DLC. That's a fair price, especially if they are being released digitally.
What about fully featured from a small studio?
I've said here 20 to 30 US dollars or 30 to 50 Australian dollars. Again, there are some very impressive games in the indie space from smaller studios that don't have the big budget, but they've still been able to have pretty good production values, near AAA production values in some cases, or certainly the quality of the gameplay experience that makes up for the lack of that AAA big budget aesthetic. But yeah, to me, that's a fair price for games that don't necessarily have that much razzle-dazzle, but they still have that great gameplay experience.
What about online only?
See, this is tough, because you could make it free-to-play, but then there's going to be advertising, there's probably going to be season passes, etc. As far as being able to buy it outright, I've said 10 to 15 US dollars, 15 to 25 Australian dollars. I'm assuming there's going to be a lot of content with that online-only game.
And lastly, what about mobile?
So for mobile games, I've said free-to-play with ads, up to 15 Australian dollars or 10 US dollars to remove the ads or buy a full version that doesn't nag you with ads anymore. I've really been enjoying a free-to-play darts game. I've mentioned this on the podcast and in a couple of articles this year. Not going to mention the name of the game because I'm not going to promote it, but I've really been enjoying that game. There's a deal in that game that if you buy any item from the store for any amount of money, you don't get forced ads anymore. There are still ads that you can watch for currency, for extra perks, which I will do from time to time, but I've removed the ads by spending $1.50, which I think was pretty good. Lifetime removal of ads for $1.50. A lot of mobile games are trying to charge 40 or 50 Australian dollars to permanently remove ads. So that was a great deal. So I say free to play with ads, up to 15 Australian dollars or 10 US dollars for a full version of a full-featured and high-quality mobile game to either remove the ads or buy the full version of that. I wouldn't go over $15 for that.
So I just want to point out, before I give my responses, that we didn't discuss this before the show. We didn't copy each other's notes or anything like that. But my answers are very similar. In fact, they're identical on mobile. I'll say that for a fully featured big studio, between 50 and 70. And the reason why I say some can go up to 70 is because I look at it this way. If I take a trip to the movies, and I'm not saying that the cost of a trip to the movies is fair either overall, but if it's 2 tickets and whatnot, it can be anywhere between $30 or $40. So if I take a couple trips to the movies and I get like 4 or 5 hours of entertainment, that would cover basically the cost of a $70 video game. But in that $70 video game, if I'm getting hundreds of hours of entertainment and a challenge, and let's say it's a sports game, and there's just a bunch of modes that I can sink my teeth into, and it's a complete game, I think that I got my money's worth for that $70. Same with an RPG with deep character development, hundreds of hours of playtime, something that makes you think, something that makes you engaged throughout, etc. I think you could justify possibly a $70 price tag on those games. And oftentimes those games, like the ones I'm mentioning, are just absolutely epic and they're great, whether it's a sports game or an RPG, etc. As it relates to the $50, $60 price point, I think that's historically, Andrew, what you and I have paid for new video games, right? And this is going back to, buying games in the 90s, etc. We're used to that price tag for video games. Sure, I think that money is tighter for a lot of people now, but I think you could justify, a fully featured big studio game still being between that $50 and $70 price range. For a small studio, I would agree with you, $20 to $30. And I think that you could justify $40 for a fully featured small studio game if it has, complete offline capabilities, online capabilities, and, you can get, a lot of hours out of it. Some of these small studios are making some fantastic games, right? And they're putting a lot of, love and care into those releases and trying to give consumers what they want. I think you could justify up to $40 for a small studio fully featured game. Online only, I'm at $19.99 or lower, to be completely honest with you. And possibly $10 if you're going to have any costs above the base game, whether it be related to DLC or access or anything like
Season
that.
Passes,
but for example, a game like NBA The Run, if that was released with online only, I don't know how you can justify making that game more than $19.99. That's my opinion on it. The only way that it could be more is if you get in the front door in $19.99 and then they offer you the offline experience as DLC, right? And I don't think that's a good look, and I don't think that that's what they should do. But I'm just in my head, I'm having trouble justifying an online only game being more than $19.99. And then, like I stated, I agree with your mobile piece. I think that free, if there are any costs when you get into the game, or $10 or under if the game is complete when you download it. But yeah, I guess that's the way that I look at it. Let us know what you think in the comments. Do you have anything else that you wanted to add before I get to the community's responses?
Yeah, I will say that the free-to-play darts game that I'm playing, obviously there's a lot of microtransactions in it if people want to sink money into it. Like any other free-to-play game, it is counting on the whales to supplement the people who are not spending money, as I'm not. But the fact that it is a pretty fun experience to play for a few minutes every day, or maybe up to half an hour every day when I feel like killing some time, unwinding without playing a full game, it's been pretty good value. Basically spending $1.50 or so to remove ads permanently, and pretty well-made game. And that's the thing, is that it comes down to how good is the game. Because I wouldn't say that these price ranges are necessarily a hard and fast rule that you couldn't go slightly higher, or indeed slightly lower for that matter, than the ranges that I've quoted. You certainly make a compelling argument for going up to $70 round about 100 Australian. Depends on the size and scope of the game. With indie games as well, going up to 40, if it really is above and beyond what you'd normally see from a smaller studio, then you can definitely get away with it. As long as you can justify the price, as long as the quality of the game can justify that price, going slightly higher, I think, is certainly fair. And the same for online only. Anything over $20 feels like too much.
So let's get to the community responses. We'll start with Twitter. Andrew at Andrew the X states, sports titles in US dollars. So he's targeting sports here. He states, big studio, $45 to $50. Small studio, $20 to $25. Online only, he states, free but charge for season passes and cosmetics. And mobile, free of microtransactions and ads, or $5 without both. Now, I do want to point out that he states big studio, $45 to $50. I actually agree with him if the game is going to try to push you with microtransactions, right?
Yep.
So, with like Madden or 2K or whatever, if it's going to push microtransactions on you and you're going to have to pay over and above the base cost of the game, I completely agree with you. When I gave my fully featured opinion as it relates to big studio releases, and I'm saying $50 to $70, that would be with like no microtransactions overall in the game. And if you're charging $70 for a video game, I feel like microtransactions, DLC, etc., it shouldn't even be a part of it. You shouldn't have to pay over above the base price. So I actually agree with what he's stating for his prices overall. However, I worry with the way these companies operate, where he says online only, free but charge for season passes and cosmetics, because then for these developers, that's a free-for-all, right?
Unfortunately.
And unfortunately. And it just gives them an avenue to make people spend well more than that $20 figure that I mentioned for an online-only game.
And to the point of releasing something cheaper, facilitating microtransactions or DLC, if a big or small studio put out a game that was $10, $15, $20 cheaper than normal, and it was a fantastic game, and then they released an expansion pack that was $10, $15, $20 that was worth getting it, I'm willing to pay that as well. That is a fair price, because it is value for money, and that's what it comes down to.
Stephen at the Live King states, no game should be more than $50 fully featured. Online and mobile games should be free since they are pay to win and probably will include microtransactions. Companies overspending shouldn't be the consumer's problem, and I completely agree. Like I said, I think you can justify a fully featured game being more than $50. I mean, we justified it back then as well, when we were spending $70 for an N64 game and whatnot. But at the same time, a lot of these games that are fully featured now come with DLC that, if you want a complete experience, sometimes you have to get that, or you'll be pressured into microtransactions in the game. Now, I will point out that, due to wages not catching up with inflation, somebody could form a fair and realistic argument for games, never being over $50 fully featured. So I'm not saying I disagree with him or Andrew the X. I mean, I'm sure you could justify it.
Yeah, back in the 90s, a lot of Nintendo games here in Australia were around $95 to $99, around about that $100 price point. But to that point, if you look at the exchange rate, that is equivalent to what you were paying in the US, around that $50 to $60 mark. And that has come down a little bit in recent years, actually. But again, you don't have those same production costs because you're not releasing on cartridges. You've got a lot more digital releases as well. So these are the factors that are not being mentioned by people saying, oh, games should be even more expensive than they are.
T Gentry at Bucky_T states, fully featured big studio, $50 to $60 max. Fully featured small studio, $30 to $40 max. I think I stated $20 to $40. Online only, $20 max. That's what I said, $19.99. And mobile, he states $10 to $15 max. And like I stated, if there's no microtransactions over and above the base cost of the game, $10 is my opinion. So very in line with what I stated. And he states, I say all of this to say in a perfect world. And he's into retro gaming right now. And that's a good way for people to get their video game fix, whether it be in sports, adventure games, action games, RPGs, and to get in there at a lower price. And I think you would agree. I think that there's just a lot of great deals out there on classics, and that's not to justify the rising costs of video games, especially as it relates to DLC and microtransactions in them and whatnot. But you try to get your hands on some of the classics, and whether it be sports games or not, and you could have a lot of fun.
Absolutely. We're huge advocates for retro gaming and retro basketball gaming in particular. I will say, though, that there is a lot of gouging on the retro gaming market at the moment. A lot of sellers, especially on eBay, looking to cash in on people's nostalgia, looking to inflate the prices. Oh, this is old, it's rare. There's a lot of games that are not rare. There's a lot of copies in circulation, so you've got to be wary of that as well. People jacking up the prices in the retro gaming market. So that is an issue there as well. Be a savvy consumer, as we've said before. But yeah, unfortunately, there is a bit of inflation there with old games, treating them as these valuable antiques. And obviously some games are rare, as you know, Derek, and there aren't many copies out there. Or there's collector's items, like leaked copies of NBA Elite 11. Obviously, those are fetching huge prices because there's only a few of them in circulation. They are such curiosities. They are collector's items. But for the annual releases, especially on 6th and 7th generation consoles, the PC versions are a bit rarer actually, but even so, they shouldn't be going for anywhere near new game prices. But yeah, shop around, because those 6th and 7th generation games that hold up so well, you can get them at fairly good prices, as you should.
So Andrew, what did we get for responses on Facebook?
So Beyonce Claybold Cody Lundborg, fantastic name there, says, wait till it's $6.99 in August. And I think a lot of people are doing that now, Derek, waiting and getting the games later. It's harder with online support and live service content, obviously, but people are waiting a bit to get into games, and understandably so.
It's a great idea. And I often post the Steam deals on the Discord when I see some of the Steam sales going on, and you can get some amazing AAA games and just some of the best indie games for dirt cheap at times, depending on the sale, 70, 80, sometimes 90% off. A game like Borderlands 3, that game was recently on sale for like $5, Andrew, right? That's hundreds of hours you can put into that game, and it's a AAA studio that develop it. And, there's just countless deals on Steam, going on all year round. And I believe that's the way it is on, the console marketplaces as well. So keep an eye out for those sales.
Yeah, don't give in to FOMO, is our advice here. Cross Charles says, I play a lot of My Team, so I like to see it no more than $100. Fully loaded, unless I get the game 3 weeks early. And that's another point, Derek. The special editions often do have those extras, packs throughout the season, extra in-game currency, etc. The value of that currency is not always great, and the packs, being loot box mechanics, don't always give you great rewards either. But yeah, that is something we've noticed, and we touched on it during the NBA 2K26 preview season actually, that a lot of the pre-order bonuses don't seem to be as good as they used to be. And those editions are getting very expensive. Obviously, they've lost the League Pass, which was a big draw in the premium edition of NBA 2K the last few years. That wasn't available in NBA 2K26, quite interestingly. But yeah, people will pay more if they're getting some extra bonuses, some collectibles, etc. But the quality of those and the quantity of those seem to have really declined.
I feel for anybody who really tries to get into My Team. And, I'm sorry about the prices related to that. I know that it's not my fault, but, I feel for consumers, because even buying the $100 version of the game or the $150 version or whatever of the game, you're still not getting what you paid for. I think that it's an absolutely ridiculous price. And, the players that you want in that mode are oftentimes locked behind different seasons, right? So sometimes you can't even get your player until later in the game cycle, until that season is released. And oftentimes the season passes themselves, you got to pay for those. Your pack odds are absolutely terrible. So you can spend like 100K VC on like a bunch of, My Team packs and boxes and everything, and you could just get a bunch of duplicates or crap cards that you don't want, or you don't get the player you want, and then you just spent $100 to $150 on the game and you didn't even get the players that you wanted. So I absolutely hate that system and the way it works, but they make bank on it. The company makes so much money on this model, and it's unfortunate. And like I said, I feel for those playing My Team.
And finally, Ricky John Uns says, since nowadays, regardless of platform, the standard is to pay to win, pretty much nothing to be fair, $60 to $70 is maximum for him, and those games need to be working once the servers are shut down. And that goes back to what we talked about before, Derek, disposable games, half the game seemingly being missing because of the online content involved. Once the servers are shut down, that goes, you've only got half a game. What's left may still be replayable, but they're definitely not designing games, especially the annual sports releases, to have that nostalgic return years later. I can go back to NBA 2K14 My Career, play into my 7th season in 2K14 My Career, and 2K15 and 16 and 17. 18 and 19 have very stripped-down versions of an offline My Career. You could see the writing was on the wall once the neighborhood was introduced. But yeah, once those online components became such a big part of gaming, My Team, Ultimate Team, My Career, now that it is an MMORPG, yeah, you're losing big chunks of games. Back in the day, you'd pay for that game, you own it for life, basically. You've got that physical copy, you've got anything that comes with it, manuals, feelies, etc. that were awesome back in the day, but more importantly, you've got that fully featured game that has all of its content. So that is something that's changed, and that is something that needs to be acknowledged when we talk about how much should games cost.
Yeah, again, disposable games, and I feel like NBA 2K21 through 2K26, disposable games, right? I think that with the server shutting down, after 2 years, and you missing big chunks of those games, I think it's unfortunate.
But thank you as always to everybody who weighed in on this topic. Certainly a contentious issue with gamers these days because of all the issues that we mentioned that don't always get mentioned, Derek. So I am glad that people are speaking out, people with a platform, people within the industry or who were in the industry, like Fallout co-creator Tim Kaine, like Stacey Henley, and of course, regular gamers like us. And we are content creators, so we do have a platform of sorts. But yeah, I think we need to push back on the rhetoric that is justifying really greedy practices in basketball gaming and other genres as well.
Yeah, I think it's just important to factor in all context, right? Wages, inflation, the cost of everything. And I think that most people, miss the full context. How much did you pay for Garfield card, Andrew? $1,000 maybe?
I mean, Yeah, I should have.
Or you can't really put a price on that
No.
experience, I guess. Right.
And of course, we do need to check out that new Garfield cart and dedicate a whole show to it, because it is a life-changing product. But with that being said, that has brought us to the end of this week's show. Thank you for tuning in, and a reminder that you can catch us every week on the NLSC, our YouTube channel, or wherever you listen to podcasts. A reminder that both we and the NLSC are on social media, so Derek, go ahead and plug the handles.
You can reach me on X, formerly known as Twitter, at D for3G and at D for384. I'm also on the NLSC, D for3, and on YouTube, D for3.
As for me, I'm Andrew in the forum and Andrew NLSC on X and Blue Sky. The NLSC is on X, Facebook, and Blue Sky at the NLSC. We're also NLSC Basketball on Instagram and Threads. We're on YouTube at NBA Live Series Center. And of course, keep it locked to the NLSC itself, nb-live.com, for all things basketball gaming. So, thank you again for tuning in, and until next time, I'm Andrew.
And I'm Derek.
Go get buckets, everyone.